Hello, everyone. Happy New Year, and welcome back to the Digital Leader Show, where our goal each week is to discuss key issues and news at the intersection of business, technology, and the humanities in hopes of making you a better digital leader. This week, we're discussing AI amping up, return to office and tech layoffs, millennial migrations, and other tech and business headlines from our curated selection of content for global digital leaders. We're live each Wednesday at noon Eastern, 9 Pacific, 6 Central European time on YouTube, LinkedIn, and Twitter. And the audio is available on major podcast platforms. Don't forget to check out DEI Network for coaching services, custom research, and other resources. I'm Dan Goodstein. I head up Digital Enterprise Institute and ERPA AI. It's the Institute for Robotic Process Automation and Artificial Intelligence. We are a professional association and peer-to-peer research network providing education, networking, and advice to over 130,000 members across the globe, all around automation, AI, and digital transformation. My co-host is Carlos Alvarenga. He's a researcher, an author, and educator at the University of Maryland and Georgetown University, and former advisor at EY and Accenture. Carlos, Happy New Year, buddy.
Happy New Year to you, Dan. Good to be back. Start another series here in 2023.
Yes, this is our first of the year. I missed you, buddy. I'm used to having these good debates with you before, during, and after our show. So I'm glad to be back here. And this is also not only the first episode of the year, but this is our 20th episode of this show. So happy anniversary.
Same to you, Dan. It was just a conversation when it started, and it's been an enjoyable 20 episodes. Hopefully, many more to come in the future.
Yeah. And if anybody's been watching, the story behind this was, Carlos and I would have a lot of these conversations in our own one-on-one calls and Zooms and things. And then finally we said, hey, you know what? Maybe some other people would find some value in listening or participating in these conversations. It's evolved into one of my favorite things to do each week. I've got really good feedback from members. It's kind of part work and business and part career and part just what's happening in the world of business and tech. And so it's been a lot of fun. There's a couple topics on our list, Carlos, but if you spend any time on LinkedIn or probably a bunch of other places over the holiday break and the few weeks preceding that, it was really, really tough to get through a scroll without hearing about Chat GPT or some of these other AI tools. Is this just like a really good marketing campaign, or is this stuff really, really gaining speed, gaining momentum?
Yeah, Dan, I won't say I obsessed over this, but I did spend quite a lot of time over the holidays alone and also with my son, who's a budding animator, on two things. One is Chat GPT, the other one is Dolly, which is kind of the other open AI platform they released, right? Chat GPT is a conversation that you can have with AI. So you can ask it a question, they'll have to explain it to you. You just kind of follow the conversation that you would with a very, I'd say, intelligent person, very well-read person, very informed person. Dolly is even more interesting because Dolly is an art creating site. So you describe something, two cats having lunch right at the Four Seasons or something like that, and then it creates an image that matches more or less what you wrote. Then if you like an image, you press a button, you say iterate, and then it creates another set of images, and that process continues, I assume, sort of infinitely until you find one that you really like, and then that becomes your art creation. So I found Dolly just remarkable. My wife's a painter, and I know how many years it's sort of taken her as a hobby, right, to learn how to paint. And this sort of, I think of it as a really transformational moment. I think that this is AI handing anybody, right, the ability to create art. If you can think of it, if you can describe it well enough to the AI, and even at this very early stage, right, it will create an image, and some of the images are really wonderful. So that's just something that hasn't been possible before. It would be like if you had an AI and said, "Look, write me a song about a guy who's having a great day, right, and discover something interesting," and then out would come originally composed music, which then you can take and publish as your song. And that might be the next thing that's around the corner between now and the year is over, that everybody becomes a composer, everybody becomes an artist already through Dolly. And I think that's there's to me as a writer and as a critic, right, especially of creative work, I find this remarkable. I don't think it's hype. I think there's something in this Dolly thing that is the reason why, especially the art community, it is the quote unquote talk of the town, right? It's remarkable achievement.
You know what I love about it? Watching this whole thing kind of transpire, online and through some conversations, that we had over the last few months, is the access that people have to the direct access that they have to this. There's always been this. I feel like these ebbs and flows when it comes to AI and the use the word hype, right? Where people were kind of promised an AI assistant with the woman named starts with an A and ends in an A that I don't want to say, otherwise everybody's devices pop up. And it kind of wasn't that. It was a little bit of that. It's really natural language processing is what it really is, and it understands some level of what you're asking for, but it didn't really kind of fully play out, I think, the way people expected. And then people went through this phase, I think, of kind of being disenfranchised about it. Like they don't really understand what it is. They don't really understand how it affects them. Is it real? It's not like the Terminator stuff. So like, how does this actually affect my life? I hear about algorithms all the time, and supposedly, the websites that I use are getting better because of algorithms. And I know I'm getting better advertisements because of, so-called algorithms. Like, how is it affecting my life? Like, I'm not playing chess with this thing. How is it affecting now? All of a sudden people spent, I think you're in the majority. I think so many people spent a good chunk of their time off playing with this thing. I mean, I saw these apps that people were building and content that people were sharing and images and so now it's like, oh, all of a sudden, you're not just the recipients of good or bad AI, whether you like it or not. Now all of a sudden individuals are getting their hands dirty and playing around with it, seeing the magic.
Part is this, artificial intelligence. The artificial part we all understand. It's the second word where things get interesting, right? Because you'd say, well, let's define what that is. What does it mean? It's always been a misnomer, really, I think, right? We don't really define what intelligence is when we apply it in this term. And I don't think that DALL-E or ChatGPT are intelligent at all, but they are a kind of creative platform, right? And so that's what I found interesting. One of the chats I had with the GPT was about the poet Alexander Pope. So I said, tell me about Alexander Pope, and it did. Then I asked to give me an example of a poem, and there was an example. And I said, give me another one, give me another one. Then I asked who else wrote like him? And it goes, well, give me a list. On the list is John Dryden. Well, show me a Dryden poem. It shows me a Dryden poem. And so you could see where a year or two from now, this is a conversation, but a true conversation, right? Where it says, well, did you ever, because right now it's sort of reacting, but if a year it says to me, well, yeah, not only that, but this is somebody else who was very influenced by Pope, and you maybe have never heard of it, then you sort of begin to discover. And then there is this true sort of back and forth, right? Again, I still don't think it's intelligence, but it simulates intelligence. And I think that has a very interesting role. I think in teaching, from anything from teaching, education, look, even training, management, right? What if there's a version of ChatGPT that has every case study ever written at Harvard Business School or ever taught that's been plugged into it? And you say, okay, give me an example of a company that was struggling with a product launch. And he goes, yeah, I'll give you three. These three things happened at company A, B, and C. There was Gore, there was this, there was Apple. Tell me more. Well, this is what happened in the project. This is what they did. So I don't think it's that far away to see somebody say, hey, as of tomorrow, right, there is a AI management consulting app. This is my old job, right? That's what John Stewart says. Yeah. And you can sit there and interact with it, and it's got every case study. It's got everything that's happened, right, in major business sort of literature over the last decade. And you can spend hours understanding and conversing with it for free, if it ends up being free. So I think that both of them are a window, right, into, at least for me, the first true window into say, okay, this is a technology that within a few years could radically change scores of professions.
Yeah.
It's not Google, right? It's not give me a list of things to look at. It is a true interaction, or let's say the promise of true interaction between a machine and an individual, right? And we just haven't had that up to now.
But I think the Google thing is interesting, right? So, if you think about the way, in its time, Google revolutionized the way that we, got information, to the point where, we were talking a couple weeks ago on the show about, now we're almost in the opposite problem where there's so much information out there. There's so much data out there, that it's difficult to disseminate what's real, what's not real, what's good data, what's not good data. And I remember, getting a list, years ago of like all these Google search rules or tricks or tools. And I'm thinking to myself, I'm a somewhat technical person. I didn't know half of them when I first saw that list. The average consumer doesn't know that you can use Google. If you type the word site, you can search within a site. There's all these different parameters, which, to the tech community, like, oh, this is really easy to use compared to, being under the hood. But to the average consumer, not so much, right? And so now you take something like this, and, it becomes what a lot of people have sold AI to be for a while, which is a true assistant, right?
Yeah.
Where you could actually have, or as one of our advisors said, a few years ago in a talk, really a companion, a coworker, so to speak, a co-pilot.
I agree. I think assistant is almost not even the right word. But I think what you see in there is the beginnings of a companion, a co-pilot, right? A co-manager, whatever it happens to be. And you're right. Google, to me, Google created it's an inventory machine, right? So how many show me all the articles on the Civil War and I'll come 1 million, whatever, right? It's up to you to sort through that inventory. It doesn't really do much more than that. You can focus the inventory search because you use Boolean terms, whatever it happens to be, but it's still just a big giant warehouse, right? It's a warehouse of information that you can search, right?
The bias research, we talked about this, a bunch of times too. It's also based on, the organization that runs it and gives it to you for free, what they want you to see, right? It's their algorithm, it's their advertising, business. I wonder if this thing gets to a point where you can kind of program it and say, hey, don't ever show me an anti-Semitic thing again, right? Because I know that's bad. I know I don't agree with that. So eliminate that from future interactions. Now I want to do this search, or I want you to help me create execute a task, with that understanding. I interviewed a few years ago this guy who had built, he claimed to have built the first ever emotion processing chip. And it's actually a piece of hardware that converts emotional triggers into a computer response and vice versa. And one of the questions I asked him was, how do you avoid bias? Right. And he said to me, and it was very profound, that I'll not do it justice the way he explained it to me, but he goes, in order to avoid, what you saw with Microsoft AI and the anti-Semitic learning and some of those things, is he said you have to do two things. He goes, one is the machine has to serve the person. And number two, it has to be compassionate. I thought that was an odd way of explaining a computer, but he said, it has to kind of lead with compassion and doing positive things versus, negativity, which breeds, all the bad elements of society. So it's kind of beholden to you, but with the parameter of it's trying to, help you, and in a positive way, never in a negative way. And that's a really interesting paradigm, right?
And I think when we look around, right, what tech continues to be, although we talk about software so much, I think when we conceptualize technology in our lives, it tends to be hardware. It's the phone, right? It's a device, and maybe Google was sort of the first of these things that we conceptualize software, right? But AI goes to another level. The question is, will there then come a device, right? Where, sort of, in other words, what I'm trying to say is, hardware sort of led, right, in mobility and in the PC age, and then software was sort of created and it kind of gave it its value, right? We were almost always waiting for the new version of a laptop, not a new version of Google. Nobody even knows what version of Google we're on.
Right.
With AI, it might be different, where you say when a new iteration of these engines comes, there's a whole new set of hardware that's sort of created. Because if I think about Dolly, if you say, okay, now attach to it a printing machine, right? A machine that could create this thing. Now I've got an art studio, right? And I own the art, and I say make 50 copies. I go on Amazon, and they're for sale. 50 quote unquote originals, right? And then I'm going to destroy the master. Uh, you've now recreated what has existed in various times in art history, which are painting machines, right? There have been many famous painters who never painted or didn't paint all their work. They hired people who would paint for them. They would sign the final work, right? It was sold as an original. And so we're a couple steps away from me creating an art factory, anyone creating an art factory, right? And so that's what I find just remarkable, that then anyone becomes an artist. And I was thinking about this in the book. I just finished a book, right, that's going to be out this year. And I was thinking, if somebody said, hey, all of that work that I did over the last year in 5 years would be useless or not needed, because I would just tell, hey, chat, write a book about persuasion, and out would come my book, right? Would that be better or worse? I don't have any problem with that, because it would have freed me for not having to spend a year writing this book, and I could have done other things on top of that, right? So I find it, I see people who are on the kind of creative community who are sort of freaked out about some of this stuff. I don't. I really think it's remarkable. It would be wonderful for me not to have spent a year writing a book, or the next one that I just started, and I can just say, hey, write a book, write this book for me, and let's talk about it over the course of the next 3 months, and out comes the book instead of a year's worth of work. So I just think it's amazing.
Yeah, listen, and I'm always a big believer in, the workforce will, should and will evolve, and the types of work that we do will change, but not necessarily, go away. The promise of whether it's AI or automation is that, it allows humans to focus on, more human things, less on operation efficiency and, monotonous, tasks, and things. But I will say the creative angle is interesting, because the original selling point, on a lot of this technology was, hey, it's going to do the mundane, but it's not going to be able to replace human creativity. And there are examples of that, like you say. I hope that this, beyond what it does to the creative community and to the content creators out there, and some of the things that it does today, I hope it's also serves as a source of education for people, who have corporate jobs and look at this and say, okay, I'm starting to grasp what AI can do, because AI is a very difficult, like a lot of technology, but certainly, it's I think even more challenging to explain AI to the average customer, right, within an organization, because of some of this disenfranchisement that's happened, because of what you said before, that it's kind of this misnomer, this over. The reality is AI is really 3 or 4 different technologies that people like to use this blanket AI term, right? You have kind of the data machine learning world, you have the computer vision world, you have the natural language processing world, and then you have the automation world. And so, people kind of overuse the term AI. But what I will say is, I think if it gets to the point where people realize there's some value in it, and they don't kind of roll their eyes when you say, hey, this is AI powered, which is kind of what's happened, over the last couple of years. I think that's good. I've been involved in conversations, where I speak to customers, and, I'll get kind of the after the meeting conversation with them. And I'll say, why did you decide not to go forward with whatever, this project, this vendor? And it's because the company couldn't explain what it actually did.
Yeah.
Right. It was this giant black box. And so, they realized there was some value at the end of the tunnel, but they struggled with kind of understanding how I'm going to get there, and how do I buy something that I don't understand how it's going to get me from here to there.
Well, look, I've always had a thing in my mind, which is I call it the forecast genie, right? So earlier in my career, I worked in one of the, in setting up one of the very early kind of analytics outsourcing contracts when I was at Accenture, and we had this long conversation with the client about outsourcing forecasting. So it's a fashion brand, outsourcing forecasting from their team to us, and I kept coming back to they had this thing about, hey, we need to create the forecast, right? And I said, well, do you? And I said, I'll just give you a thought experiment. If there was the forecast genie that every Friday slipped an envelope under your door and said, this is next month's demand or next quarter's demand for every product in every store, are you really not going to use it, right? Because you don't know who the forecast genie is. It could be anybody. You have no idea. It just disappears. It just magically appears in your door, right, once a quarter. Of course not, right? It doesn't matter. You're going to take the forecast genie. If the forecast genie is 99.9% accurate, you're going to use the forecast genie's forecast. And really, if you sit there and you think about ChatGPT and you say, well, how far away are we really, right? The end where you say, look, it doesn't matter, because if you ask this thing, how many units of whatever you make, we're going to have to produce in the next quarter, and it is right. Are you really not going to build to that number, right? Are you really not going to hire to that number? Are you really not going to innovate to that number? Looking at Dolly, all I kept thinking about was additive manufacturing, right? So there you go with Dolly, and now Dolly connects to a 3D printer, and I say I want to create this object, and I go through my 2 or 3 hours of iterations on Dolly, and then I say, Dolly, make 100 copies of this, right? And then there are 100 units. So now I'm in manufacturing. Anybody's a manufacturer, right? Now someone who knows how to work a CAD system. Now Dolly replaces CAD design, right, and that entire process, and 3D printing connects to Dolly, and then now you say, make me this, make me that. If you can imagine it, you can sort of create it. And I think that's what's really interesting. And you're right, this idea of are we seeing in these two technologies, right, the beginning of portals in which somebody can say, show me something, teach me something, explain what's happening in the marketplace, right? Why did our product not sell? Or why is our product selling really well? Then you begin to kind of fully realize what we've been talking about for 10 years, which up to now, it hasn't been there. But it requires an interface. And what I find interesting about Dolly is the interface, right? Is that describe something to me, and I'm going to keep working at it until I show you what's in your mind. And I find that's very interesting.
Yeah, and I would say the other problem, other than the black box thing with AI, is the fear of what will happen to me, if the job that I do today is replaced, right? It's a natural fear, but the reality is, again, I'm very evolutionary when it comes to this stuff. It's gonna happen. So what I tell people is, I said, figure out how you move up the value chain, right? So maybe you're not the one that creates the art. Maybe you're the one that interprets the art or aggregates the art or applies the art to a new project or a new idea. Leverage the expertise that you've built over the years of creating that. Not to, it's the calculator thing, right? Yeah, it's great to know all the arithmetic, but then there's calculators. So you can continue doing the arithmetic, or you can use the calculators to do more advanced math because the calculator is doing certain things for you. That's the analogy I use, because these things should all be foundational. It's going to get to the point where creating text, creating copy, getting answers, creating art, doing certain forecasts is a great example. Those things are going to all be done. It's what you do with that information that's going to, set you apart from other people.
Actually, one other thing too. Before the holidays, I went to a dinner that Duke Continuing Education set up in DC, and the guest speaker was Vivian Ming, the sort of noted AI strategist and scientist, and we got into this conversation with her about questions, right? Because so much of AI, you see it in chat and also in Dolly, is the best user of Dolly is the one who can ask the best question, right? Who can formulate the best query, right? What would it look like if you drew this, if you drew that, right? And so I find it fascinating because I brought up to Vivian, who I'd met before when I was at World 50, a book called The More Beautiful Question, in which the author lays out this very interesting thesis that, hey, when we're little kids, we're praised for coming up with good questions. Nobody expects us to be good answerers, right? The best, oh, that's a great question, whoever's asking the question. But somewhere around the age of 10, things flip around. And we now begin to be rewarded for being good answerers.
Hmm.
By the time you get to high school, nobody cares what your question is, right? Just have you learned the answers, and then that sort of takes over for the rest of your life. And the argument of the book is so much of innovation, so much of even in leadership, in his view, it revolves around asking the right question. And he gives you lots of reasons. How do you sort of regain, right? How do you reconstitute your question asking ability, which is devalued for the most part in the professional world, right? There isn't a professional questioner role for the most part. AI is in these early iterations, what I can see it already is that it will bring back the great question. The ability to formulate the right thing that you want to ask chat, or the right thing you want Dolly to create, right, becomes really important. And then that becomes the value added skill set.
Because the application isn't there yet, right? So I think, again,
will be right, Dan, unless it takes over, because it's there. Ask it the right thing, and there's the creativity.
Right.
The production, it is the imagination of what it is that the AI should do for you.
But to your point, there's still value in being the person that knows what to ask and how to get the most out of even a relatively smart engine like that, right? And so, I think, back to the misnomer thing and the overused AI term. I think that people think of things as dumb and manual, or deep learning, all knowing, can do everything AI. And they don't realize that there are several stepping stones between the first and the second. And we're in those middle areas, those gray areas right now. So, there's still a value out there in applying knowledge to use these tools. It's not completely artificial yet. It will get there at some point, but I don't think it's going to get there at most of our lifetimes. Now, it is accelerating at a astronomical pace compared to any other, technology. And it becomes, I think it will become a platform for a lot of other technologies, as you alluded to before in the, when you're talking about the hardware. But there's still plenty of room right now for that half step of, hey, this thing is super intelligent, but I still need a person who can, apply these tools to the right problem and get the right outcome. And I think the people that really win in the next few years are those people that recognize what this can do and stop doing the things that it can do and learn to apply it in an intelligent way.
The other thing that I saw or see in chat is, look, from my very first day as a consultant, I went through how many versions of knowledge management systems, right? Because every consulting firm is obsessed with this topic. And complex, simple, version A, version B, it has been, quote unquote, a holy grail of lots of different people, lots of different startups, lots of different leaders, and lots of companies, right, to capture what the company knows in some way. And for the most part, at least as far as I know, most of them have failed. They either didn't work at all, or they became obsolete very quickly. The information was stale, or they were just too expensive to sort of maintain, right? With a few exceptions here and there. I thought Accenture did actually a very good job with trying to keep up with what it was learning as a firm and making that available to people. But for the most part, most people don't. If suddenly, right, along comes, I think what I would imagine would be one of the first applications to say, listen, everybody who works at your company is going to spend a day, right, talking to, right, whatever it is, right, AI, knowledge management 1.0. And part of your job will be to talk to the computer once a quarter, explain to the computer what you've been up to, what have you learned, what have you not learned. And this thing is ingesting, right, from every single person. And then that is made available to every other single person, right? That question of, hey, I'm a consultant. I'm on a project wherever I am, right? Working for, I don't know, Philips in the Netherlands. And I go, is anybody else working on this issue somewhere in the firm that could have 300,000 consultants? And they go, yeah, there are 5 projects that are working on this right now. These are the deliverables from the last 3 projects, right? Would you like to read what they wrote in the final report? Yeah, show it to me. I see it's not crazy to imagine that we might in a decade have something like that available if what you see in ChatGPT continues that on that evolution, right? Then you go back to now to the question of training. How do you train it and how does it learn? But maybe that's solvable in some way. Maybe that's a new job will be
Yeah.
a person who's very good at preparing people in a company to train AI.
Well, you're reminding me of a conversation we had a long time ago at one of our events about big data and somebody, talking about, and it was actually a very similar fear, not as big as AI, but a similar fear that, with all this data, all these data tools, all these data and analytics tools, that it was going to take people's jobs within organizations. And I remember, and I don't remember who it is, but I remember the speaker saying this because it jumped out at me. He said, the jobs will stop being about data wrangling, but data is not necessarily intelligence. People confuse those two things, right? You need one to get to the other, but there's an intelligence factor that is not necessarily there if you just have a bunch of data, right? Someone's got to analyze that data. Someone's got to interpret that data. Somebody's got to apply that data. I think that's where we are with knowledge. I think knowledge is at the point where it's no longer valuable. Try to, we've talked a lot about the, content on this show, people paying for content, not wanting to pay for content. How easy it is to get content. I don't think knowledge is I think knowledge is a commodity now. It's more about, taking that knowledge and getting it into a point where it's actionable. And then you add automation to it, and now all of a sudden you have the term we use, intelligent automation. People always say, how is that different than AI? That's how it's different, because now you have this intelligence, and then you take the intelligence and you can actually apply it in an automated way, and that's when you start getting real things done.
I mean, look, I give another use case, right? So I have this book, 101,000 words. You know what I would love right now? A system where I could upload the book and have it cross-check everything that I put. It's 250 footnotes, and just say, all your footnotes are correct, all the quotes are correct. By the way, you missed 3 books that you might want to reference because you just didn't know they existed. So this has been a very manual, labor-intensive process. It's traditional, old-fashioned scholarship of finding a book, reading a book, seeing if it's worth anything, right? I spent 5 days going through a 400-page book just to realize that it wasn't really that useful, so I'm not going to quote it in the text. So it would be wonderful to say, upload, right, the manuscript, and then have it come back and say, okay, before it goes to print, here are 5 sources that you're not aware of because they're in different languages. Oh, yeah, one is in German. I'm going to translate it for you. Yeah, please do so, right? And what it will do for scholarship, for research, which then brings us into business again, right? Of understanding what's out there, what's relevant to you. It's not that it's there, but to me, what's interesting about these 2 platforms is that you can, at least for me personally, I can see the beginning of the road. Right? Finally, okay, what you could do in a decade is completely different from what we could have imagined a few years ago. We could have imagined it, but it wasn't really there in front of us. We begin to see the beginning of that now.
Well, and I think it's a really interesting point you made before about training, and that the knowledge that companies deal with, knowledge transfer and things, right? So there was this interesting report that came out of the New York Times about the whole COVID and the kind of Great Recession, Great Resignation, and the concerns about recession, and it turns out that a good chunk of those people just moved jobs, right? You have like 2 million people that kind of retired, okay, and then according to one of the reports in November of 2021. About 4.5 million Americans voluntarily left their jobs. So what this New York Times article is saying is that, it may have been more of a reshuffle, a great reshuffle than a great resignation, but it's actually hurting the economy because productivity within these companies is way down. And the thing that they mentioned specifically, to your point, is that the kind of unending cycle of hiring and training and losing people and laying people off and people quitting and quiet quitting and then bringing people back on. It's killing them from a resource training, onboarding. By the time they get people up to speed, they're gone.
And you're right. And this goes back to that question of how does an employee learn about the company they've just joined, right? And so and we still have a very, I mean, it's 19th century, right? It's here's some manuals, here's some things that you have to read, and it is that hasn't evolved, right? Over the course of the last century. It's a pretty old-fashioned system, which is why we have these problems. We have a 19th century training model, right, in a 21st century economy. So maybe, right, these technologies finally do deliver on what's been talked about for a long time, which is the ability to help somebody get up to speed in a way that doesn't require the cost that you have today. And I was thinking about something else, right? You say, look, somebody who's asking a question of who in this company knows X. This was a classic question, right? Analogy. Okay, I want to find there's somebody. I have 100,000 employees. Has any one of them ever worked on this kind of thing, or knows about this particular project or this technology? Right? It's a question that can't be asked today. You're not going to go through 100,000 resumes trying to find out if any employee worked on a particular thing. That alone, right? Which again, I think is within the realm of the possible today. When you say we want to synthesize everything we know about everybody who works here, at least their professional history, so that someone who has a skill set can be found in a matter of seconds. Right? That also now changes the dynamic of what do you understand about the workforce. Of course, right behind it, you get the sort of the dark side of this, right? What is the risk of capturing all that? But to your point a minute ago, right? It's evolution, so I don't think we're going to go back on this one. I think we're headed for a world where your professional digital self will be digitized by a company when they hire you. I think part of the onboarding process in a decade will be that you'll have to submit to a digitization process.
Yeah, and yeah, this also gets back to one of my favorite topics, as you know, Carlos, which is, hey, how do we actually retain people? And so layoffs aside, and there was another one. We thought maybe it was kind of turning a corner, and then Salesforce just announced a big layoff as well. So the tech layoffs kind of continue, but a lot of these tech companies. Were also the ones that hired the most quickly during COVID. So, there may be some kind of rebalancing, of the workforce there. But
what if in a decade retention is irrelevant? And I'll give you a scenario. So you go to work at Amazon, and probably would be Amazon will do this. Amazon says, okay, great. This is your salary. And by the way, if you agree to be digitized while you work here, right, you get a 10% bump in your salary for every year that you agree to participate. What does that mean? It means that all your actions, all your decisions, everything you write, everything you say is being recorded. So 5 years later, you've got a threshold where you have been captured enough that even if you walk, as you quit, you're given a choice. Hey, if you allow us, because you were a valuable employee, we will pay you royalties, right, on all the tasks that your digital self, which stays at Amazon, performs. Every time they ask you a question, every time it solves a problem, you get a check. So now we're in a world where, and I really do think this is the future, where you will go through a digital onboarding, you will be tracked, and if you're very good at your job, then you will be compensated. And when you walk out the door, you can offer to leave yourself behind, either indefinitely or for some period of time. And if you work in 3 or 4 companies, you could be making checks from 3 or 4 companies by the time you get to the 5th one.
Carlos, I'm going to personally forward you all of the angry emails from all our lawyer members who are going to see this and say, what the hell just happened to IP law? But no, it's very interesting, right? And so and you know, as crazy as that sounded when you first started saying it, it's happening, right? The whole quiet quitting thing, the
Yeah.
whole gig economy thing. By the way, the people, the numbers that don't get reported are, while all these companies do all these layoffs, a lot of time in the same breath that they're doing the layoffs, they're hiring consultants, right? Which are just 1099 gig employees. And then at that point, it's like, well, where's that line between you hired me as a company, so what I do is my IP, versus, you know, I'm an employee, and so what I do is your IP, Mr. Employer.
Right.
So that line becomes grayer, and then you add public domain knowledge, chat GPT stuff into it. Who's to say, to your point before about management consulting, who's to say that that's, I'll pick on EY's IP versus Accenture's IP. You know, that becomes more and more commoditized.
Look, I think in the future, we had this in consulting where you say, okay, there comes a point at the beginning of your consulting career. A partner once told me, you're in the room mostly because of the firm, not because of you. Right? If you're good and you make it all the way to the top level, it flips. The firm is in the room more because of you and not the other way around. Right. So your job is to make that transition happen as quickly as possible and to make it as valuable as possible. That the only reason Accenture or PwC is there is because you're there, which is the opposite when you just get out of business school. So now we get to a world where you say, look, I've been a consultant, I've made partner, I've got 20 years of working on supply chain or marketing, whatever it is. And I've got the option to stop working, and I'm just going to upload everything I've learned and then license that machine, right, to any firm that wants to use it or any company wants to use it. That's a really interesting world, because right now that doesn't exist. There's always been this issue in consulting or professional services where you're limited the number of hours you can work on a client because there's just so many hours you can work in a day. If I can make 5 copies of me and license those, it's kind of what I'm doing now with the book. Right, which is say, okay, here is 20 years worth of thinking and about this particular topic and years of research, and now I'm putting into a format that anybody can purchase. Theoretically, what would be wonderful, and by the way, it's what I was chatting about with somebody today, is they came to me and said, hey, we want to talk to you about creating a kind of digital version of what you know that's not in the book or that enhances the book. And then anytime anybody accesses that, we'll pay you a royalty.
Interesting.
Yeah. So I think that's been something which the creative quote unquote classes have had for a long time. But maybe one thing that AI will change is that it will bring it into business, and it would allow the most creative and the best managers to move into a royalty world where what they know can be used and sold anywhere, and the value they create can be exploited on a global level, not just within one company.
So what's your thoughts on this return to office thing that seems to always rear its ugly head every 4 to 5 months? There seems to be another. I mean, based on what you just said, that becomes less and less important, right?
I think it already is. This is just the natural thing of like people like span of control and they like to see it. And I think a lot of people do miss the workplace, right? There were lots of things that happened in the workplace that people sort of enjoyed, the human interaction, right? Most people don't want to work by themselves. And so the tension is always to sort of to go back to that world, but we're not going back to the way it used to be. That's just not going to happen. I do think that there are just human elements here where there are just CEOs who don't like remote work, don't like people who don't live in the town, that they live in, right? We still have relocation, we still have offices, so that's not going away. But the model that we used to have is not coming back. And again, it goes back to how much leverage do you have, right? So the people who have hardcore leverage, who can say, I write the rules of my employment contract, those who have that kind of power, who don't want to come back, are not going to come back.
I'm all for the hybrid. I think that there's certainly benefits of collaboration and for creativity reasons and team building and things like that. But for day-to-day work, especially the kind of work that you've been talking about that could be done with your digital assistant or co-pilot, There used to be this time management course that I took that broke your work week into kind of buffer days and productivity days, right?
Yeah.
And so, like, your productivity day, you're going to get more done probably if you're working from home. But then there's kind of creative days, and there's more interactive and relationship building days. And I love that what this whole thing has done is it's forced the paradigms to be questioned, at least.
Right.
And companies are being are looking at things differently. I saw an article this week about Shopify scrapping meetings.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Where they said, hey, if there's more than 2 people in this meeting, kill it. Just kill it. It's a drain on productivity. It's an unnecessary meeting. They call it the calendar purge. Interesting, right? All of a sudden, you don't necessarily need that meeting where half the people don't show up. You talk about things that can be done via email. Why do it?
Well, work remains the if you walk around a typical office in most places, right? It's a model that wouldn't look out of place 200 years ago. So maybe because of the pandemic and because we're about to enter the first real accelerated shift, right, in the nature of work. It's been promised, it's been suggested for decades, but it really hasn't happened, right? At the end of the day, there are, whether it's a cubicle or an office, people sitting in a room, some kind of physical space, right, having meetings and having conversations. But maybe, right, this confluence of COVID, AI, a few other things, now we finally do get this what I would call sort of the great rethinking of what work is supposed to be, what it should look like.
It's only going to make people happier. It's only going to make employees happier. If you find the mix that works for them and for you, that's the ideal scenario, right? You create this dynamic where it's not the employer versus the employee, like we've talked about. You get what you need, but you also give the employees what they need. Otherwise, you're going to lose them anyway. The fantasy of, hey, you're going to do everything the way I want you to do it, the way I want you to do it at your expense. It's also a misnomer, right? Those people are going to leave. They're not going to stay.
One more thought, right? Because we're at the birth of the neurodiverse workforce, right? And as people who are on the spectrum, various forms begin to be accepted into the workplace. And I think that this is an interesting thing, because I think that one of the things that a lot of neurodiverse people have is an affinity for machines, an affinity for AI, which seems innate to them in a way that isn't to quote unquote mainstream people. So I believe that that's the other factor that's here, right? That there's an expansion, there's a widening of the door, of the work door. Who can come into the corporate workplace today that's only going to expand? And so add a different kind of human. My youngest son is on the spectrum, and I see it within him. Right, his relationship with technology is different from my older son, and so I think that is another factor, right? That this is a generation of kids that thinks about technology and interacts with it in a very different way. And as they shape more and more of the workplace, as AI begins to fulfill its promise, and as COVID broke the mold of what a workplace looks like I said, we may be at the forefront of the next decade. The next 2 decades may see more change in what the workplace looks like than the last 100 years, or even 200 years.
Yeah, and I think also happier people, which is ultimately a good thing. There's this piece about the millennials kind of migrating south, right? If all of a sudden you have to be in the office 4 times a month, you could fly and go to your meetings and spend a few days in the office, and then live where you want to live, not because the company decided that they're in this city, or like a buddy of mine a number of years ago, the company decided that everybody that was a director level or higher had to pick up their life and move from the East Coast to Texas on 3 months notice, right? That's not good. That's not good for morale. Those are not going to be happy people, and not going to be happy employees, and not be happy with your customers.
Like I joke that as time moves on, more and more corporate work looks like consulting, and flat organizations, team-based work, right, virtual work, which we were doing for decades, and and this issue of commuting. Most consultants grow up right professionally flying 4 or 5 days a week. I commuted to Atlanta for years, every Monday morning at 6 o'clock. So the in that profession, there is no connection between where you live and where you work, right? And once again, as that model maybe migrates more and more, we'll see more of that as well. That it won't really matter that the fact that because you're 1 month of 1 week a month you're in town, the other time you're sort of gone, it'll reshape that relationship between work and location, which again goes back right 200 years. So yeah, I wouldn't say that we are, but we might be right then at a real inflection point in terms of what is working. If we were to come back in 2050, we might see a completely different, something that's radically different than what we have today.
Embrace it, embrace the change. So many people are always afraid of change because it's the unknown. This situation was the opposite. We were forced into it by the pandemic, and we got to feel it and see it and go, hey, wait a second, this ain't so bad, right? So maybe that's a good way to leave our first show of 2023 on a New Year's resolution.
So time's up again. So we'll see you next week.
Yeah, absolutely. If you're watching and you need help, you're looking for research, you're looking for coaching, or you just want to chat, feel free to reach out to us. Go to DEInetwork.com. Let us know what you're working on. And in the meantime, we'll be back next Wednesday, noon Eastern. Have a great week, everybody. Carlos, have a good week, my friend.
I'll see you next Sunday. Bye-bye.